The first word the boy ever spoke did not come in a hospital. It did not come during therapy. And it did not come at home with his parents. It happened inside a small church in New Mexico, on a quiet Sunday morning, the kind of morning where nothing unusual ever happens. The choir had just finished the opening hymn. People were settling into the wooden pews, and near the back of the church sat a 6-year-old boy named Daniel. Daniel had never spoken in his life, not one word. Doctors had told his parents to prepare for silence. But that morning, something strange happened. Without warning, Daniel slowly stood up. His mother reached for his arm. "Daniel, honey, sit down." But the boy didn't look at her. He started walking down the center aisle. Step by step, every head in the church began to turn. Daniel walked straight toward the statue of the Virgin Mary near the altar. He stopped, looked up, and then, for the first time in his entire life, the silent boy opened his mouth. What he said next made the entire church fall into stunned silence. Years later, people who were there that morning still say the same thing. We all heard it, and none of us have ever forgotten it. Before we continue, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Stories like this travel across the world. And today's story begins with a boy who had never spoken until the moment he stood in front of the Virgin Mary. Daniel Rivera was 6 years old, and in all those years, no one had ever heard his voice. Not his parents, not his teachers, not the doctors who had spent hours testing him. Silence had followed Daniel since the day he was born. At first, people told his mother not to worry. Boys sometimes speak late, they said. Give him time. But months turned into years. Daniel learned to walk. He learned to point at things he wanted. He even learned to smile in a quiet, gentle way that made people feel strangely calm around him. But words never came. By the time Daniel turned 4, the specialists had already delivered the sentence his parents feared the most. A neurologist in Albuquerque spoke softly across a desk covered in medical charts. We believe Daniel may never develop normal speech. His mother, Elena Rivera, sat frozen in the chair. Never. The word echoed in her mind for weeks. At home, life slowly adjusted to Daniel's silence. Elena learned to understand the small signals. The way he tapped the table when he was hungry. The way he tugged her sleeve when he wanted to go outside. The way his eyes brightened when sunlight streamed through the kitchen window in the early morning. Daniel noticed everything. He simply didn't speak. But there was one place where something about him seemed different. Every Sunday morning, Elena took him to St. Michael's Church, a small adobe church on the edge of town. And the moment Daniel stepped inside that quiet sanctuary, he always looked for the same thing. Not the altar, not the candles, but the statue standing quietly along the sidewall. The statue of the Virgin Mary. And whenever Daniel saw her, he would stop walking, as if someone had just called his name. For Elena Rivera, silence had become part of daily life. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that settles quietly inside a mother's heart when she is afraid to ask certain questions out loud. Questions like, will my son ever call me Mom? When Daniel was younger, Elena used to sit beside his bed at night and whisper small words, hoping he might repeat them. Say Mama, she would murmur softly. Mama. Daniel would look at her with those calm, thoughtful eyes. But no sound ever came. Friends tried to comfort her. Some suggested therapy programs in larger cities. Others told her she should simply accept that Daniel might always live inside his own silent world. Even the doctors eventually stopped offering new ideas. But Elena refused to stop hoping. Every Sunday, she dressed Daniel in the same small blue sweater and drove 15 minutes to St. Michael's Church. She didn't come because she expected a miracle. Not really. She came because it was the only place where her heart felt a little lighter. Inside the church, candles flickered softly along the walls. The smell of old wood and incense filled the quiet air. And while other families knelt together in prayer, Elena would sometimes sit alone in the back pew with Daniel beside her. She rarely asked for anything specific anymore. Her prayers had become simpler, shorter. Sometimes they were only a single sentence whispered in the silence. "Mother Mary, please watch over my son." And each time she said those words, Daniel would slowly turn his head, looking toward the same statue along the sidewall, the statue of the Virgin Mary, as if he already knew exactly who his mother was speaking to. At first, people thought it was just a child's curiosity. The statue of the Virgin Mary stood quietly along the left side of the church. It wasn't large, just a simple statue carved from pale stone. Mary's head was slightly bowed. Her hands were open, as if welcoming anyone who came close enough to notice. Most people walked past it without thinking, but Daniel never did. Every Sunday, the moment he stepped into St. Michael's Church, something about him changed. He would slow down, his small shoes tapping softly against the tile floor. Then he would stop, right in front of the statue. Sometimes Elena had to gently guide him toward their seat. "Daniel, come sit with Mommy," she would whisper. But the boy rarely moved right away. Instead, he simply stood there, looking up, not smiling, not moving, just staring quietly at the face of Mary. After a few months, even Father Miguel began to notice. One morning after Mass, he watched from the sacristy doorway as Daniel stood silently in front of the statue again. The boy didn't fidget like most children. He didn't look bored. He didn't seem distracted. He looked attentive, as if someone were speaking to him. Father Miguel later told Elena with a gentle smile, "That boy prays better than most adults I know."
Elena Lauget Politelli.
But she didn't know what to say, because sometimes when Daniel stood there long enough, something else happened, something she could never quite explain. The boy would slowly raise his hand and lightly touch the base of the statue. Then he would close his eyes, for just a moment, as if he were listening to a voice no one else could hear. After a while, people in the parish began to notice Daniel. Not because he spoke, but because he didn't. Children usually whispered during Mass. They swung their legs under the pews, dropped him books, or tugged at their parents' sleeves. Daniel did none of those things. He sat quietly beside his mother, watching, listening, observing everything. Sometimes Elena wondered if her son understood far more than people assumed. One Sunday, an elderly woman named Rosa sat in the pew behind them. Rosa had attended St. Michael's Church for nearly 50 years. She had watched generations of children grow up in that small adobe building. After Mass, she gently touched Elena's arm. "That boy," she said softly, nodding toward Daniel. "There's something peaceful about him."
Elena Smilet Politelli.
People had said things like that before, but Rosa leaned closer. "I saw him earlier," the old woman continued. "He was standing in front of the statue again." Elena sighed slightly. "Yes, he does that every week." Rosa shook her head. "No," she said, "not like today." The woman lowered her voice. "I was sitting near the candles, and I could have sworn." Daniel was smiling. Elena looked at her son. Daniel rarely smiled in public. In fact, it almost never happened. But Rosa continued. "And when he smiled," the old woman whispered, "there was the strangest feeling in the room." Elena frowned slightly. "What kind of feeling?" Rosa thought for a moment. Then she answered with quiet certainty. "The kind of peace," she said, "that usually comes only after a prayer has been answered." For years, life in the Rivera family moved quietly between hope and disappointment. Daniel continued to grow. He learned to draw simple pictures. He liked watching birds outside the kitchen window, and sometimes he laughed softly when his father played music in the living room. But the silence remained. 6 years. Not a single word. Then one evening in early spring, Daniel's father came home with unexpected news. Miguel Rivera worked at a construction company outside town. Jobs had been slow for months, but that night he sat down at the kitchen table with a letter in his hands. "I got an offer," he told Elena. "Phoenix." Elena looked up. Phoenix was nearly 8 hours away. A bigger city, better pay, a chance to start over. But it also meant leaving everything behind. Their small home, Daniel's therapy center, and the quiet little church that had become the center of Elena's prayers. When would we have to move? She asked.
Miguel Gesetatid.
Soon, very soon. That Sunday would likely be their last Mass at St. Michael's Church. Elena didn't say anything at first. She simply looked across the table at Daniel. The boy was sitting on the floor with his colored pencils, drawing small circles on a sheet of paper, completely silent, just like always. Later that night, Elena folded Daniel's blue sweater and placed it carefully beside the door, the same sweater he wore every Sunday to church. She whispered a quiet prayer before turning off the light. "Mother Mary," she said softly, "if we are leaving, please keep watching over my son." Across the room, Daniel lifted his head, and for a brief moment, he looked toward the small statue of the Virgin Mary standing on the family's shelf. The following Sunday morning arrived quietly, just like every other Sunday before it. Sunlight stretched across the desert hills outside town. The small parking lot of St. Michael's Church slowly filled with cars. Families stepped inside one by one, some carrying prayer books, others holding the hands of sleepy children. Inside, the familiar sounds of the church echoed gently through the adobe walls. Wooden pews creaked, candles flickered along the side altar, and the statue of the Virgin Mary stood in her usual place, bathed in soft morning light. For Elena, everything felt different that morning, because she knew something the others didn't. This might be the last time Daniel ever walked through these doors. She held his hand a little tighter than usual as they entered the church. Daniel noticed the change. He looked up at her for a moment. Then he gently pulled his hand free. Elena assumed he was heading toward the statue again. He always did, but something about the way he moved that morning felt different, slower, more certain. Daniel walked across the tile floor, past the first few pews, and straight toward the statue of the Virgin Mary. He stopped in the same place he always stopped, right in front of her. But this time, he didn't just stand there. He lifted his face and looked up longer than usual, so long that even a few people nearby began to notice. From across the church, Father Miguel watched quietly, and for reasons he could not explain, the priest suddenly felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if something important was about to happen. At first, only a few people noticed Daniel. A woman lighting a candle near the sidewall, an elderly man adjusting his glasses in the front pew, and Father Miguel standing quietly near the altar. Daniel was still standing in front of the statue, completely still. Most children his age would have already grown restless. But Daniel didn't move. He simply looked up. The soft morning light from the stained glass windows fell gently across the statue of the Virgin Mary. For a moment, the church felt unusually quiet. Even before Mass had officially begun, the choir members were still arranging their music. People were whispering softly as they settled into their seats. But Daniel remained in the same place, watching, waiting. A young mother nearby leaned toward her husband. "That boy has been standing there for a while," she whispered. Her husband glanced over briefly. "Maybe he likes the statue," he said with a small shrug. But Father Miguel kept watching. Something about the boy's expression caught his attention. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't confusion. It was something else. Something deeper. Daniel looked as if he were listening. After a moment, the priest stepped slowly down from the altar steps. Not to interrupt, just to see. Daniel's small hand slowly lifted toward the base of the statue. The same gentle gesture he had made so many Sundays before. But this time, his fingers didn't stop there. They rose slightly higher, toward the open hands of the Virgin Mary. And suddenly, Daniel turned his head toward the center of the church, as if he had just heard someone call his name. For a moment, the church felt strangely still. Daniel was still standing in front of the statue. The soft light from the stained glass windows rested gently across the figure of the Virgin Mary. A few people nearby had begun watching the boy now, mostly out of curiosity. Children usually wandered during the minutes before Mass began. But this felt different. Daniel didn't look distracted. He looked focused. almost as if he were listening to someone standing right in front of him. From the altar steps, Father Miguel paused. He had been about to begin the opening prayer, but something made him stop. The boy slowly lifted his head, his eyes fixed on the statue. Then something happened that no one in that church had ever witnessed before. Daniel opened his mouth. At first, no sound came out. His mother, Elena, froze in her seat, her heart suddenly pounding, because in 6 years, she had never seen her son try to speak. Not once. But this time, the boy tried again. His lips moved carefully, slowly, as if he were repeating words he had just heard. Then, in a small but clear voice that echoed gently across the quiet church, Daniel spoke. "Don't be afraid." The words were simple, soft, but the effect was immediate. A woman near the candlestand gasped. Someone dropped a prayer book. Father Miguel felt his hand tighten around the missal. And Elena covered her mouth with both hands as tears filled her eyes, because the silent boy who had never spoken in his life had just said his first words, and he had said them in front of the Virgin Mary. For a few seconds, no one moved. The entire church seemed frozen in place. People looked at one another as if they were trying to confirm what they had just heard. Did the boy really speak, or had they imagined it? Daniel was still standing in front of the statue, his small hands resting against the base, his eyes lifted upward. Elena slowly stood from the pew, her legs trembling. "Daniel?" she whispered. The boy turned his head slightly toward the sound of his mother's voice, but he didn't walk back to her. Instead, he looked again at the statue of the Virgin Mary, and then, just as softly as before, he spoke again. "She says." The words came slowly, carefully, as if he were repeating something exactly the way he had heard it. People in the nearby pews leaned forward. Even Father Miguel stepped down from the altar. No one wanted to interrupt. No one wanted to breathe too loudly. Daniel's voice remained calm, gentle, almost peaceful. "She says, this is your home." The words drifted through the quiet church, and suddenly Elena began to cry, because those words carried a meaning that almost no one else in that room understood. The Rivera family was preparing to leave town that very week, and Daniel had never known how to say anything about it. Not until this moment. Father Miguel slowly made the sign of the cross. A woman near the back pew whispered through tears, "Holy Mother of God." Daniel looked once more at the statue. Then he lowered his eyes and quietly walked back down the aisle, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Daniel walked calmly back toward the pew, the same quiet way he had walked to the statue. But the church behind him had completely changed. People were no longer whispering. They were staring. Some stood frozen beside the pews. Others looked at Elena as she slowly stepped forward to meet her son. Her hands were still shaking. "Daniel," she said softly. The boy looked up at her, his face peaceful, almost as if nothing unusual had happened. Elena knelt down and held his shoulders. Did you just speak?" Daniel didn't answer right away. For a moment, he simply looked past his mother, back toward the statue of the Virgin Mary. Then he nodded, just once. Father Miguel walked slowly down the aisle. The priest had served at St. Michael's Church for nearly 20 years. He had seen baptisms, weddings, funerals, and moments of deep prayer. But nothing like this. He stopped a few steps away from the boy. "Daniel," he said gently, "who told you those words?" The church became silent again. Even the choir members had stopped moving. Daniel looked up at the priest. His small voice returned, still soft, still calm, but unmistakably clear. "She did." Daniel lifted his finger and pointed toward the statue of the Virgin Mary, and a quiet murmur moved through the church like a wave, because everyone knew something that made the moment even more extraordinary. Daniel had never spoken before that morning, and yet now, he had spoken twice. The story spread quietly at first, just a few families talking after Mass. Then neighbors began asking questions. Within a few days, nearly everyone in the small town had heard about what happened inside St. Michael's Church that Sunday morning. But for Elena Rivera, the miracle didn't stop there. Later that same week, she took Daniel back to the specialist in Albuquerque, the same neurologist who had once gently told her to prepare for a life of silence. The doctor reviewed Daniel's old files, 6 years of notes, speech development tests, therapy evaluations. Everything pointed to the same conclusion: severe speech delay.
Possibly permanent.
The doctor leaned back in his chair and looked at Daniel carefully. "Daniel," he said slowly, "can you tell me your name?" For a moment, Elena held her breath. Daniel looked at the doctor. Then he answered, "My name is Daniel." The words were clear, simple, but unmistakable. The doctor blinked in surprise. He tried again. "Can you say your mother's name?" Daniel turned toward Elena.
Elena.
The room fell quiet. The neurologist closed the file in front of him. Finally, he spoke with honest confusion. "This kind of change, we almost never see." He paused before adding quietly, "I don't have a medical explanation for it." Elena didn't argue. She simply held Daniel's hand, because in her heart, she already knew the answer. The same answer Daniel had given inside the church. She did. Something changed in St. Michael's Church after that Sunday. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly. People began arriving earlier for Mass. Some came just to sit in silence for a few minutes. Others stopped near the statue of the Virgin Mary before taking their seats. They would light a candle, touch the base of the statue, and whisper a short prayer. Father Miguel noticed the difference almost immediately. For years, he had gently reminded the parish about faith, about patience, about trusting God even when answers did not come quickly. But now, people seemed to understand those words differently, because they had witnessed something with their own eyes. One evening after Mass, the old woman Rosa stood again near the candles, the same place where she had once watched Daniel smiling at the statue. She turned to Father Miguel and said softly, "You know, Father, I've been coming to this church for 50 years. The priest smiled. "I know." Rosa looked toward the statue of Mary. "But I think," she said slowly, "that little boy reminded us how to look again." Father Miguel followed her gaze. The statue had not changed. The church had not changed. But something in the hearts of the people had. Because sometimes faith grows louder after hearing the quietest voice in the room. A few weeks later, the Rivera family made their decision. They stayed. Miguel declined the job in Phoenix. The offer had promised more money, a bigger city, more opportunities. But Elena told her husband something she could not ignore. "Daniel spoke here," she said, "and he spoke because of her." Miguel didn't argue, because he had been there that morning too. He had heard the words, just like everyone else. Life slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. Daniel continued speech therapy. His words came slowly at first, a sentence here, a question there. But the silence that had surrounded his childhood was gone. Sometimes visitors who had heard the story would ask him the same question. "Daniel, why did you speak that day?" The boy never gave long explanations. He never tried to convince anyone. He simply answered the same way every time, with the calm voice of a child who had nothing to prove. "She told me to." Then he would glance quietly toward the statue of the Virgin Mary, the same statue that still stood along the sidewall of St. Michael's Church. Unchanged, silent, but somehow, never unnoticed again. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or flashing lights. Sometimes they come quietly, through a child, through a single sentence, through a moment that no one in the room was expecting. The people who were in St. Michael's Church that morning still remember exactly how it felt. A silence, a voice, and a message that reminded everyone that heaven sometimes speaks, in the most unexpected ways. If this story touched your heart, write the word Mary in the comments and tell us, have you ever experienced a moment in your life that felt impossible to explain? Subscribe to The Quiet Miracles and share this story with someone who still believes that faith can change everything. Because sometimes, the quietest voice carries the greatest message.